December 1st, 2016, my husband Jim and I were sitting on the couch watching something on Netflix. Okay, we were nodding off, pretending to watch something, when suddenly there were gunshots. They were loud, they were close, and we were no longer drowsy. I said to Jim, "Do you think we should call?" Meaning, should we call the cops? See, gunshots aren't a daily or even weekly occurrence in our South Richmond neighborhood, but they're not a complete anomaly either. But before Jim even had a chance to answer that question, we heard footsteps running up onto our porch and a voice. "Help me! Help me! I've been shot!" Jim flew to the window and he shouted, "Show me your hands!" And as if to answer him, the next thing we saw was a bloody palm pressed against the beveled glass window by our front door. Jim opened the door and let him in. He was a tall, skinny, young guy. He looked like he was about 14, but we found out later he was actually 20. He staggered into our dining room, sat down in the chair that Jim had pulled out for him, and Jim said, "Call 911, get me some towels." And I grabbed my cell phone, I dialed 911, and I don't know if it was my cell phone or my brain that wasn't working, but it didn't go through. He said, "Get me my phone." So I got him his phone. I ran downstairs. I got some old clean towels. I brought them back upstairs. And so there was Jim with the cell phone cradled on one shoulder, putting pressure on this young guy's leg that was bleeding profusely. He'd been shot in the hand. There was a place where another bullet had grazed his scalp, but the worst wound was through, we later found out, clear through his knee. And there was a lot of blood. I went down 2 more times to get more towels. When I finally had come back and the blood seemed to be slowing down a little bit, the young man, whose name was Tyrell looked at me and he said, "Can you call my mom?" We have 2 sons, just a little bit older than Tyrell. "Sure," I said. Well, my phone wasn't working before, but I'll try. What's the number? But of course, he was in shock, and, well, nobody knows phone numbers anymore, right? They're in your cell phone. And he said, "Oh, man, I left my phone in the car. I can't remember." That's what had happened. He'd been sitting in a car with a friend when another guy that they knew had walked up and opened fire. I patted Tyrell awkwardly on the shoulder and I said, "I'm sure that when you get to the hospital or when the paramedics get here, they'll help find your mom. I'm sure they will." But speaking of the paramedics, where were they? It seemed like it was taking forever for them to get there, and that was when I remembered that nobody ever finds our house the first time. It's because the city messed up the house numbers. They go from the 20s and then hop up to the hundreds with nothing in between. And I ran out the front door and there was a sea of blue light from all the cop cars just down the block. But I saw the fire chief driving his truck the wrong way down our one-way street. I waved him down and I told him the situation, and sure enough, The ambulance had gone to the wrong address, but they were there in a few minutes. They came in, they were kind, they were professional. But there was one poignant moment. They were cutting away Tyrell's jeans. He said, "Man, don't leave me naked." "No, we won't, don't worry." As they were taking him out on the stretcher, I patted his shoulder again and I said, "I'll pray for you." And then they took him to the hospital. Well, by then, all the cops had come and they had gathered out on our front porch, and Jim and I walked out. And the cops began to ask us questions. "Did you know him?" "No." "Why did he come to your house?" "I don't know." "Did you have your porch light on?" "No." And then one of the cops seemed to be really concerned. He said, "You know, it's not a good idea to let people you don't know into your house." And Jim and I just kind of looked at each other. It hadn't seemed like an option not to let him in. Then one of the cops opined that Tyrell was probably a gang member, and it wasn't a totally unreasonable supposition. There are a lot of gang shootings in Richmond, and there had been earlier that week even. But they didn't know. We didn't know. We looked at the cops, we said, "Well, I guess we'll go in. There's a lot of blood to clean up off the dining room floor." And they said, "Oh no, you can't clean it up yet." We said, "What?" "Well, it's a crime scene. You have to wait till the tech comes to get the jeans and the shoes before you can clean up the blood." I never knew before that night that blood has such a distinct smell. It's coppery, and it seemed to fill the entire house. So Jim and I went and we sat on the couch again and just kind of stared into space. When the tech came about 2 a.m., she walked in and she was picking up the jeans, and she finds a little scale for weighing pot, I guess, in the pocket of the jeans, and she sort of makes some kind of noise, and she puts those in the evidence bag. She puts the tennis shoes in the evidence bag. She looks at all the blood on the floor and she says, "Well, I hope you were wearing gloves. You never know what one of these people might have." One of these people? A person of color? A person who was a gunshot victim? A person who was, I don't know, what? Jim and I were so fried at that point that we didn't say anything. We just wanted her to get out of there. We cleaned up the blood, we went to bed, but I could not stop thinking about all this, and neither could he. And as we do when we've gone through something, we're trying to figure out what it means, why it happened, what makes sense of it somehow. We tell the story. We tell the story. And so one evening, not long after that, I was telling the story to this woman that I know who's a civil rights activist. She's been that for decades. She's in her 80s, and she's worked with at-risk youth for a long, long time. And as I was telling her the story, I said, you know, I just couldn't stop thinking, he could have been my son. And she said something that just nailed me to the wall that I'm still trying to figure out how to live into. That could have been my son, I said. And she looked me in the eye and said, he is your son. Thank you.